In the beautiful city of Greystone, there was a very prestigious school called Elizabeth's College, which was known for its excellence and perfection. Elizabeth's College was popularly known for its bright students and numerous exceptional awards. Whenever they were invited to any school competition, Elizabeth's College always came first and wins flawlessly. Because of all this, all the parents in the beautiful city of Greystone wanted their children to be students of Elizabeth's College so that their children would be among the best. Unknown to them, that behind the excellence and perfection that Elizabeth's College showed the public, there was something unusual going on behind the scenes. In one of the classes in Elizabeth's College, there was a very cruel teacher known as Mrs. Habibat, but the students nicknamed her Mrs. Thorn because she was very different from the other teachers in the school. Mrs. Thorn was known by all for her sharp tongue and wicked stare. She ruled her classroom with an iron fist, as if her classroom was a military base. Mrs. Thorn was very brilliant and exceptional, but her temperament and personality made her a monster that sent shivers down the spine of the students whenever they heard her name. The mention of her name sounded like thunder, and each time she walked past any class, the students became very quiet at the sight of her, as if an angel was passing by. Mrs. Thorne's classroom was literally divided. She arranged the students in her class in such a way that all the fast learners and bright students sat at the front row, while she placed the slow learners and the students who were struggling at the back rows. Mrs. Thorne showered love and care to the students at the front seat and affectionately called them the stars because they were very brilliant. They did well at every subject. They were always the first to raise up their hands whenever a question was asked, and they hardly made mistakes. But she disliked and mistreated the students at the back seat. She referred to them as the shadows because they were not as bright as brilliant as other students. They were students who struggled in class and would often ask questions because they didn't understand things easily. Mrs. Thorne was always impatient and merciless to the students she called the shadows, and they always became very scared and afraid whenever Mrs. Thorne turned her attention towards them. Anytime the slow students made a mistake or stumbled on their words or failed to solve a math problem, Mrs. Thorne would beat and punish them mercilessly in front of the whole class or scold them loudly for the entire world to see. "You useless and senseless child. Do you have the brain of a human being or the brain of a goat? You foolish thing." Mrs. Thorne would yell at them and ridicule them in front of the whole class. Because of this, the brilliant and bright students would often mock their fellow students because they weren't as smart. They refused to associate with them and saw themselves as the gods of the class. They hated and disliked their fellow students because of the praise that Mrs. Thorne showered on them in front of the whole class. One of the students seated at the back among the shadows was Ogechi. Ogechi was a very soft and quiet young girl. She was the daughter of very busy parents who had only time for their businesses. Ogechi loved to draw and write stories, so her mind would often wander during lessons, and she also struggled a lot with mathematics and numbers. Mrs. Thorne saw Ogechi's struggles as weakness and laziness and would often ridicule her in front of the class more than others. "Ogechi, maybe you should go back to being a baby. I don't think you belong here. You are too dumb and dull," Mrs. Thorne told her one day during class activities when Ogechi was unable to solve a math equation on the board. The whole class started laughing at Ogechi as she walked back to her seat with tears in her eyes. The next day, after Ogechi's parents had prepared for work, Ogechi told them that she didn't want to go to school. Her parents were very surprised. "Are you sick?" her mother asked, but Ogechi shook her head and told them no. Instead of asking Ogechi why she didn't want to go to school that day, they assumed that Ogechi was becoming very stubborn and reckless. "I can see you are becoming something else. You want to stay at home and watch movies while your mates are in school reading and learning, eh?" her mother yelled at her in anger. "You are lucky I'm already late for my flight. If not, I would have flogged some sense into that stubborn brain of yours," her father said. They forced her into the car and dropped her off at school after giving her some money for snacks. Ogechi felt very helpless and deeply hurt. She didn't know what to do or who to meet about what was going on and what she was going through in school. The atmosphere in the classroom grew heavier with each passing day. The stars enjoyed Mrs. Thorne's praises, while the shadows grew more and more withdrawn and started doing worse in their subjects because they were very scared of her. Whenever Mrs. Thorne was asked to provide a student in her class for a competition or tournament, she would pick a student from one of the stars and completely ignore the shadows as if they didn't exist. No one knew what was going on in Mrs. Thorne's class, and the students were very scared to report her to the school authorities out of fear that she would pounce on them. So Ogechi and the other shadows continued being mistreated until one fateful day. A new student called Musa was enrolled into Elizabeth's college and was admitted to Mrs. Thorne's class. Musa was very tall for a child of his age, and he had a strange confidence than anyone else in the class. Mrs. Thorne assigned Musa to the back seat among the shadows because she assumed that the reason why Musa was admitted to her class, despite how tall he was because he wasn't brilliant or smart. It didn't take long before Musa noticed the injustice in the classroom. He saw how Mrs. Thorne belittled, ridiculed, and mercilessly mocked the student at the back seat, and how the other students followed her lead by frequently looking down on their fellow students because they weren't as smart as them. So Musa decided that something had to be done. One fateful day, during an English lesson, Mrs. Thorne called on all the bright students to read a passage of an English comprehension. They all read the passage fluently without any errors, and everyone clapped for them. Then Mrs. Thorne called on Ogechi to stand in front of the class and read the same passage. As usual, Ogechi had difficulty in pronouncing some words and was reading very slowly, so Mrs. Thorne started humiliating her. "Senseless girl, was this how your fellow students read the passage? Would you ever learn?" Mrs. Thorne yelled at her. While she was screaming hurtful words to Ogechi, Musa raised up his hand from the back of the class. The whole class became very shocked and surprised at Musa's confidence and audacity. It would be the first time a shadow would raise up his hand boldly in Mrs. Thorne's class. Mrs. Thorne looked at Musa with surprise written all over her face, but a smile suddenly appeared on her face because she was so sure that Musa cannot read. "Yes, Musa, how can I help you?" she asked him. "May I read the passage instead, Ma?" Musa said confidently. "Of course. Come and embarrass yourself like your fellow illiterates," Mrs. Thorne said, and everyone laughed. Musa stood up and went to the front to collect the English passage from Mrs. Thorne. Everyone looked at him in anticipation, waiting for him to make a fool out of himself. But to their greatest disbelief, Musa read the passage perfectly and flawlessly in a very steady and confident voice. When he finished, the whole class was silent. Musa turned to Ogechi and gave her the book to read. "Your turn," Musa said kindly, but Ogechi felt scared. She didn't want to be humiliated by Mrs. Thorne in front of the class again. She wanted to refuse, but Musa asked her to trust him. Ogechi collected the book and Musa stood beside her. As she read through, Musa corrected her calmly and kindly whenever she made any mistake. Her voice was trembling at first, but as she continued reading with Musa's assistance, her voice became strong and more confident with each word. When Ogechi finished, the whole classroom was very quiet. Then, one by one, the students at the back of the class started clapping for Ogechi. It would be the first time a shadow would surprise the class. Mrs. Thorne couldn't believe her ears. She became speechless as Musa and Ogechi walked back to their seats with bright smiles on their face. From that day forward, The other students at the back seat became very close to Musa to teach them how to read and solve mathematical problems. It became very evident that they were eager to learn, but they couldn't learn easily because Mrs. Stone wouldn't give them a chance. Musa took it upon himself to help the shadows and often taught them how to read and solve maths questions during break periods and after school classes. He was very kind and patient towards them until they learned. Over time, the classroom began to change. The shadows started to improve because of Musa's dedication and willingness to teach and help the students with him at the back seat. But it didn't stop Mrs. Stone from humiliating them in front of the class whenever they failed to read fast or fail a maths question in front of the class. Mrs. Stone's personality disturbed Musa a lot, and he knew he had to do something. If not, his efforts would be in vain. One day, Mrs. Stone taught the class a new topic in maths. She called on the stars to answer the questions, and all of them answered it perfectly well. Then she started calling on the students at the back of the class one by one. Some of them answered the questions correctly because Musa had taught them the topic even before Mrs. Stone taught them in class. But when Ogechi was called, she couldn't answer the question. Mrs. Stone pounced on her in anger, flogging her mercilessly with her local wooden cane. As she was flogging Ogechi, ignoring her screams and pleas, she had no idea that the principal of the school was taking a stroll around the school. When the principal heard the cries and screams of Ogechi, he walked as fast as his legs could carry him to Mrs. Stone's class, where the chaos was coming from. But it was too late. By the time he arrived, Ogechi had fainted due to an unexpected stroke of cane on her skull, leaving her head bruised and blood gushing out of her head. The principal entered the class with shock written all over his face. Ogechi was lying down on the ground in a pool of her own blood, while Mrs. Stone was holding her local wooden cane, which had been stained with Ogechi's blood. The school ambulance was summoned immediately, and Ogechi was quickly rushed to the hospital. Mrs. Stone was arrested immediately by the school authority and placed in detention. Immediately the news of Mrs. Stone's predicament spread around the school. All the students were happy, most especially the students at the back row of her class. But Musa was not happy. He liked Ogechi and her personality, so he was very sad that she was hurt. Fortunately, Ogechi was treated at the hospital and her skull was stitched. Once Ogechi's parents were informed that their daughter was in the hospital receiving treatment, they both left their different businesses. Her mother drove as fast as she could to the hospital, while her father booked the next flight to the country to see his daughter. Ogechi felt very hurt when she saw her parents beside her looking worried. I tried to tell you the reason why I didn't like going to school anymore, but you all refused to listen to me. I wish I had died. Maybe you would have learnt your lesson. Her mother and father became very disappointed in themselves. They swallowed their pride and went on their knees and pleaded with Ogechi, their only child, to forgive them for placing their business and financial goals over her well-being and welfare. Meanwhile, Mrs. Stone sat in the detention center with pain in her heart, wishing and praying deep in her heart that Ogechi would survive the injury. Whenever a staff passed by the detention center, she would ask impatiently, "How is Ogechi now? Did she make it?" With worry and anxiety written all over her face. But no one answered her. They simply ignored her and walked away, and this made her even more scared. After some days, when Ogechi had been discharged from the hospital, she went with the principal, Musa, and her parents to see Mrs. Stone at the detention center. Immediately Mrs. Stone saw them. She started crying when she saw the bandage on Ogechi's head. She went on her knees and pleaded with Ogechi to forgive her for being so rude and merciless towards her. Ogechi smiled and asked her to sit down. Elizabeth's College is a school meant to nurture the students and not to break them. Your impatience and harshness has created an environment of fear where it becomes very difficult for students to learn, the principal told her. Mrs. Thorne was forced to reflect on her actions. She started weeping and apologized to all of them. Then she said, "I'm deeply sorry for being so rude and impatient with my students. I'm sorry for making them so scared of me. When I was still very young in school, I wasn't brilliant or intelligent. I wasn't smart or promising. Because of this, my teacher disliked me and ridiculed me often in front of the other students. She punished me often and made sure the other students stayed away from me because I was a slow learner, and she believed I would never become someone great in life. Because of this, I decided to be very serious with my education to prove her wrong. I started learning on my own and immersed myself in my academics. It didn't take long before I started to improve in class. It felt like a dream come true the day I took the first position in my class. So when I grew up and became a teacher, I still felt that anger and rage of being ridiculed and mocked. I felt if I did the same to my students, they would also improve and decide to study hard like I did. Please forgive me." Mrs. Thorne narrated with tears flowing down her eyes. The principal understood her plight and trauma, and Ogechi's parents were also compassionate towards her. With Ogechi's permission, they released her from the detention center, but she was given 2 weeks suspension before she resumed back at the school. In the absence of Mrs. Thorne, the classroom began to change. The stars started to admire Musa's courage and began to follow his lead by helping their fellow students instead of mocking them. Ogechi improved greatly under the support of her classmates and became very confident in herself. The classroom once again became a place of growing and understanding. When Mrs. Thorne resumed at school after the suspension, she was different. It wasn't easy for her to let go of her old ways, but with Musa's influence and therapy, she changed. She became compassionate and loving towards all the students without being different to any of them. Ogechi's parents always listened to Ogechi and learned how to pay attention to her needs. They placed her first above their businesses and made sure they made out time whenever they could to help her in her studies. They also employed a private lesson teacher to assist her during the holidays so she would improve in her academics. By the end of the school year, Ogechi did incredibly well and many other students improved greatly. Mrs. Thorne admitted that she had been wrong. She thanked Musa for teaching her what she had forgotten, that every student had potential and it is the job of the teacher to help them find it. Many years later, Ogechi became a celebrated author. On the first page of her book, Ogechi wrote, "Dedicated to the boy who believed in me and the teacher who learned to change." Mrs. Thorne was already retired and she smiled as she read Ogechi's book. Her heart was full of bittersweet pride that she had never felt before, and she was glad that Ogechi proved her wrong by becoming somebody great. The moral lesson of this story reminds us that kindness has a transformative power. Treating others with kindness and patience can uplift them in ways that harshness can never. A little encouragement can bring out hidden potential. Every individual has value. Everyone learns and grows at their own pace. Recognizing and nurturing individual strengths creates a more supportive and productive environment. Leaders can come from anywhere. True leaders inspire positive change regardless of their position or status. Musa, though a newcomer and labeled a shadow, showed courage and empathy that transformed the classroom. It is never too late to change. Mrs. Thorne's journey demonstrates that even a deeply ingrained behaviors can be unlearned. Reflecting on our actions and making conscious efforts to improve can lead to redemption and growth. Unity is strength. Collaboration and mutual support create a stronger and more harmonious community. When the students united, They bridged the divide and achieved more together than apart. Learning goes both ways. Teachers can learn from their students just as much as students learn from their teachers. Remaining open to growth and feedback is essential for anyone in a position of influence.